On June 6, 1944, just after 7:30 a.m., a 19-year-old rifleman of the British 3rd Infantry Division crouched in a landing craft bucking toward Sword Beach. Around his neck hung a crumpled operations order that every man in his battalion had heard repeated for weeks. They would land, punch inland, and by nightfall seize the road hub of Caen. The city lay barely 10 miles from the sand. Take Caen, his officers said, and the tanks could pour through the gap into the open country beyond. Take Caen, and the nightmare of fighting on a narrow beachhead would end before it truly began. Behind him, the chalk cliffs of England had vanished into the morning haze. Ahead, amid the crash of artillery and the roar of naval guns, Normandy waited. Far from that packed, reeking landing craft, in a room lined with maps at the Allied headquarters in Southwick House, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had outlined the same objective in more measured words. In the weeks before D-Day, Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group and architect of the land battle in Normandy, had assured Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower that Caen would be taken on the first day. His written plan was blunt. The British and Canadian forces landing on the eastern beaches, Sword, Juno, and Gold, were to push rapidly inland, seize Caen and the high ground beyond it, and form a firm eastern shoulder for the Allied lodgment. The Americans on Omaha and Utah would fan out across the Cotentin and the Bocage country to the west. Once the lodgment was secure, armored forces would break out into the French interior. Caen was the key. It was the crossroads where major highways and rail lines converged. Beyond it stretched the Caen-Falaise Plain, one of the few areas of open tank country in Normandy. Hold Caen, and the Allies could threaten the heart of German defenses in France. Lose it, or fail to take it, and the German panzer divisions would have room to maneuver and counterattack. Eisenhower's diary and staff notes from late May 1944 show how heavily this weighed on his mind. Overlord's success, he believed, depended on quickly gaining room to deploy the vast Allied armies crammed into southern England. Montgomery's promise to capture Caen on D-Day itself, or very soon thereafter, as he phrased it in conferences, was not a cosmetic objective. It underpinned the entire timetable. On the German side of the hill, Caen's importance was equally clear. General Oberst Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had agreed that if the Allies came to Normandy, the first counterblow must strike them near the beaches, using armored divisions rushing toward exactly the ground Montgomery meant to seize. Caen, with its road net and open approaches, was the natural assembly point. Both sides were aiming at the same place. Back on Sword Beach, the riflemen from the 3rd Division splashed through shallow surf under machine gun fire, stumbled past dead and wounded men, and pressed inland through Hermanville and Colleville-sur-Orne. His division fought hard and pushed farther than any other Allied formation on D-Day. But by early afternoon, the vanguard met the first serious German armored reaction, elements of the 21st Panzer Division probing toward the sea, soon followed by the fanatical young soldiers of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division. The advance slowed, then stalled. As evening fell over Normandy, Montgomery received situation reports from all 5 beaches. Against long odds, the Allied landings had succeeded. Omaha, so close to catastrophe at midday, was secure. The airborne drops had held vital bridges. But one line on the operations map glared like an accusation, the bold arrow from Sword Beach to Caen stopped short. The city remained firmly in German hands. For the tired British infantry outside its outskirts, that meant a longer, bloodier fight than they had been promised. For Eisenhower and his American commanders, it meant something more ominous. The plan for a swift breakout hinged on that arrow reaching Caen. Instead, as the first night of Overlord closed in, the Allied foothold in France looked narrower, more fragile, than the pre-invasion briefings had ever suggested. No one in that tense headquarters yet knew it, but Montgomery's stalled drive on Caen would lock the campaign into a grinding, 6-week battle of attrition, and force Eisenhower, Bradley, and ultimately George S. Patton to rewrite the path to victory in Normandy. Dawn on June 7, 1944, revealed a coastline that looked far less like the neat arrows of an operations map and far more like what it truly was, a precarious toehold on a hostile continent. The British 3rd Division, which had been briefed to push straight through to Caen, now clung to a shallow salient north of the city. The Canadians on Juno and the British 50th Division on Gold had also fallen short of their deepest objectives. Only the Americans on Utah had overfulfilled their plan, linking quickly with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions inland. Omaha Beach, bled white on D-Day, was secure but still cramped. Montgomery's headquarters at Crowley received a flood of reports. The terrain south of the British and Canadian beaches was more constricted than aerial photographs had suggested: sunken lanes, thick hedgerows, small villages perfect for defense. Worse, the German reaction was solidifying faster than Allied planners had hoped. The 21st Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and elements of the Panzerlehr Division were converging around Caen. Montgomery adjusted his tone, if not yet his plan. In conferences with Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, he now spoke less of capturing Caen on a single day and more of holding the bulk of German armor in the east while the Americans expanded in the west. His defenders would later argue that this had been his true design all along: abroad, holding battle north of Caen to fix the panzers, while the U.S. First Army built up strength for a decisive breakout. But his written pre-invasion outline plan and the orders issued to the 3rd Division told a different story. On paper, Caen was not a mere magnet, it was an objective to be seized rapidly. The gap between what Montgomery had promised before D-Day and what he now began to emphasize afterward would become one of the enduring controversies of the Normandy campaign. On the ground, the Allied soldiers had little time for debates over intent. For the British and Canadians, the attempt to take Caen turned into a series of hammer blows that failed to crack the German shell. Operation PERCH in mid-June, a pincer movement designed to envelop Caen from east and west, bogged down in stiff resistance around Tilly-sur-Seulles and Villers-Bocage. There, on June 13th, a single Tiger tank commanded by Michael Whitman tore into a British armored column, turning burning Shermans and Cromwells into a symbol of how costly the fight for Caen would be. When PERCH stalled, Montgomery tried again. Operation EPSOM, launched on June 26 by 8 Corps, aimed to cross the Odin River and turn Caen from the southwest. Heavy rain, clogged roads, and ferocious counterattacks from 2 SS Panzer Corps blunted the thrust. By month's end, Caen remained in German hands, its northern suburbs a shattered no-man's land swept by artillery. All the while, the calendar in Eisenhower's pocket diary advanced. Overlord's timetable, agreed in broad strokes with the combined chiefs of staff, had envisioned a breakout within weeks, not months. Instead, the Allied line grew broader but not much deeper. Every day the front stayed within artillery range of the beaches was a day when a gale or a U-boat offensive could still endanger the entire supply system. To the west, Bradley's Americans faced their own private hell. The country behind Omaha and Utah was a maze of bocage, ancient hedgerows atop earthen banks, turning every field into a mini-fortress. German infantry of the 352nd and 2nd Panzer Divisions, though battered, clung to these natural strongpoints. Without room for armored maneuver, U.S. units advanced field by bloody field, often taking heavy casualties for gains measured in hundreds of yards. Bradley understood that as long as Montgomery's offensive around Caen failed to punch open the plain to the east, the Americans would remain trapped in this green labyrinth. Eisenhower, reading his daily situation summaries, saw the same thing: the lodgment was secure, but the initiative was slipping away. A campaign that had been sold to anxious politicians as a daring stroke risked turning into a slob reminiscent of 1918. In England, one man who had been deliberately left on the sidelines watched all this with growing impatience. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, temporarily disgraced after the 1943 slapping incidents in Sicily, commanded the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group in southeast England. Part of the grand deception meant to convince the Germans the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais. Officially, he had no role in Overlord's opening. Unofficially, many in the German high command still believed wherever Patton was, the real invasion must surely come. As June bled into July and Caen refused to fall, Eisenhower and Bradley began to look beyond the immediate crisis. If Montgomery could not deliver the rapid advance he had outlined on the eastern flank, someone else would have to engineer the breakout Overlord required. That someone was still in England, waiting for a real army to command. The question that now loomed over SHAEF was stark: would Montgomery's grinding campaign around Caen eventually justify itself by pinning and weakening German armor? Or would it so delay the breakout that the entire operation risked political and strategic failure, forcing Eisenhower to gamble on a very different kind of general and a very different plan? By early July 1944, the name Caen had become a kind of curse word in Allied headquarters. For nearly a month, Montgomery's 21st Army Group had battered at the city and its surrounding villages. The ground from the Orne River to the Odin was now a graveyard of burned-out Shermans and Panthers, shattered farmhouses, and cratered fields. The British and Canadians had paid dearly for every hedgerow. Yet the great objective that Montgomery had told Eisenhower he would seize on D-Day still stood, battered, burning, but defiant. On July 7th, Montgomery launched another attempt to break the deadlock. Operation Charnwood sent 3 infantry divisions, the British 3rd and 59th and the Canadian 3rd straight at Caen from the north. That night, 467 RAF bombers hammered the city, turning entire districts into a rolling wall of flame. To British soldiers watching from their start lines, it looked as if nothing human could survive. But the German defenders had long since fallen back to positions south of the main blast zones. When the infantry moved in on July 8th, they found streets of rubble and snipers, not a shattered garrison. After 2 days of hard fighting, Allied flags finally flew over the northern half of Caen. Yet the Germans still clung to the south bank of the Orne and the vital high ground beyond. The road net remained under enemy guns. To the planners who had counted on Caen as a launch pad for armored exploitation, this was a bitterly partial victory. The city was theirs on the map, but the breakthrough remained an illusion. Eisenhower's diary from this period records a growing concern. The British and Canadians, he noted, were locked in a slog that consumed men and machines at a fearsome rate without opening the promised door into the French interior. Bradley's Americans, meanwhile, were still wading through the bocage, their own armor tangled in hedgerows that nullified speed and surprise. The fear was no longer that Overlord might fail outright, it was that it might succeed so slowly the war of exhaustion in the West would drag on for years. Montgomery's answer was one more great blow. On July 18th, he launched Operation Goodwood east of Caen, a massive armored thrust that he later described as a limited objective battle but which many Allied officers at the time believed was intended as the long-awaited breakout. 3 British armored divisions, Guards, 7th Armored, and 11th Armored, rolled forward behind another thunderous air bombardment, more than 2,000 heavy and medium bombers plowing up German positions in a swath south of the city. From the air, Goodwood looked irresistible. On the ground, it turned into a steel-on-steel meat grinder. The British tanks advanced across open fields south of Caen, ideal terrain in theory but thoroughly registered by German artillery. Mines, anti-tank guns, and dug-in Panthers and Tigers of 1st SS Panzer and 21st Panzer Divisions tore into the columns. By the end of the 3rd day, the British had reached the Bourguebus Ridge but gone no farther. They had lost more than 250 tanks, some accounts put the figure higher, for a gain of only a few miles. Montgomery quickly framed Goodwood as a deliberate killing battle, meant chiefly to wear down German armor and keep it pinned near Caen, not a failed breakout. His post-war defenders would echo that line, pointing to the concentration of panzer divisions in his sector as proof that he had fixed the enemy. Yet documents tell a more tangled story. Pre-battle orders described Goodwood in expansive terms, its objectives stretching far beyond the ridge actually taken. Eisenhower and Bradley both later wrote of their disappointment, believing they had been led to expect a fuller breakthrough. German generals interrogated after the war added another dimension. They concentrated their armor east of Caen not because they had been cleverly lured, but because Montgomery kept attacking there. His blows were real, not feints, and they responded accordingly. While the British and Canadians bled for Bourguebus Ridge, the Americans watched with a mixture of respect and frustration. 8 Corps and 19 Corps were still wrestling with the hedgerows south of St. Lo, paying in platoons for hedges that hit every machine gun and mortar. Casualty figures climbed into the tens of thousands. For Bradley, the arithmetic was simple. Every week Caen remained a slugging match was another week his men died in the bocage without room to maneuver. In mid-July, he put forward his own answer, Operation Cobra, a concentrated American blow aimed not at Caen but at a narrow sector west of St. Lo. Instead of trying to bludgeon German defenses across a broad front, Cobra would seek to shatter them on a few miles of line and pour armor through the gap. To make it work, he would need massive air support, careful timing, and a commander ready to exploit success with reckless speed once that gap appeared. By then, that commander had finally been given a real army. In England, George S. Patton had spent months drilling staff and units that officially did not exist. Now the deception role of the 1st U.S. Army Group was ending. The U.S. 3rd Army headquarters he led was preparing to cross the Channel, waiting only for the word that the line had been cracked. Montgomery's battles around Caen had fixed German armor, but they had not opened the door. Cobra, if it worked, would blow a hole in the western wall. The question was whether Patton could turn that breach into the kind of breakout that Overlord had always promised, and whether doing so would quietly eclipse the role Montgomery claimed for himself in saving the campaign. On the morning of July 25, 1944, an American sergeant of the 30th Infantry Division lay in a shallow slit trench south of St. Lo and watched the sky fill with bombers. They came in waves, hundreds of B-17S and B-24S, heavy silhouettes droning over the bocage. The air smelled of cordite and crushed greenery. For weeks, the sergeant's world had been hedgerows no wider than a field, each one a killing box. Now, Operation Cobra promised to rip a hole in that claustrophobic maze. The day before, a first attempt at the bombardment had gone horribly wrong. Smoke markers and wind shifts had confused the aim points. Bombs had fallen short onto American positions, killing and wounding hundreds, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces and a key architect of U.S. doctrine. Bradley was shaken, but the operation could not be abandoned. The Germans opposite, remnants of Panzer Division and the 352nd Infantry Division, were battered but still blocking the road to the open country beyond. Now, on July 25th, the plan went ahead with corrected markers and stricter bombing lanes. Bradley's concept was brutally simple: pound a narrow sector of the German line south of St. Lo until it ceased to function, then send 7 corps through the wreckage. Unlike Montgomery's broad frontal assaults around Caen, Cobra concentrated overwhelming force on just a few miles of front. The effect on the German defenders was devastating. Bombs churned fields and hedgerows into a continuous moonscape. Command posts vanished. Telephone lines snapped. Survivors staggered from dugouts half-deaf, their units shattered. When the infantry of the 9th and 30th Divisions went forward, they met disorganized resistance piecemeal instead of the rigid defense that had stalled them for weeks. By the second day, armor was pushing through the gap. Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7 Corps rolled south toward Coutances, then west. To the east, 19 Corps widened the breach. Reports reaching Eisenhower stated the obvious: the German front in western Normandy was cracking. This was the moment Bradley and Eisenhower had been waiting for, the moment when the campaign would shift from attrition to maneuver. And it was the moment for which George S. Patton had been explicitly held in reserve. Patton arrived in Normandy at the end of July like a caged predator finally slipped from its leash. For months he had played the role of decoy commander of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group in Kent and Sussex, his very name used as a weapon in the deception plan Fortitude. Now, with Cobra tearing open the line, his headquarters would become the operational heart of the exploitation phase. On August 1, 1944, the U.S. Third Army was officially activated. Under the overall umbrella of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which still exercised formal command of ground forces in Normandy, Patton assumed control of 8 corps and others pouring through the Avranches Gap, the narrow corridor between the shattered German front and the rocky headlands of Brittany. If that gap stayed open, the Allies would spill into the open plains of western France. If the Germans could cut it, the spearhead would be trapped. Hitler understood the danger. Furious at the collapse in the west, he ordered a counterattack, Operation Lutich, aimed at Avranches. Panzer divisions were to strike west from the Mortagne area, reach the coast, and sever the American breakout. Ironically, many of the armored formations that might have been available for this blow had been ground down east of Caen in Montgomery's battles. Others were still tied to the confront because 21st Army Group continued to press there. German generals later testified that they felt torn between Hitler's orders to launch Lüttich and the immediate, deadly pressure of British and Canadian attacks around Caen and the Orne. They could not simply strip that sector without risking collapse. The very concentration of armor Montgomery would later claim as proof of his fixing strategy was now, in part, an obstacle to the decisive counterstroke Hitler demanded. From Patton's perspective, however, the German dilemma presented opportunity. As his columns crossed Avranches and fanned south and west into Brittany, he pushed his corps commanders hard. Fuel shortages, congested roads, and the ever-present danger of a German riposte did not soften his demands for speed. Third Army was to drive, not crawl. Within days, American spearheads were racing toward Rennes and Brest, while others curled east toward Le Mans. Maps in Schaeff's operations rooms, so long cluttered with dense hedgerow symbols and short advances, suddenly sprouted long, sweeping arrows in Patton's sector. Behind them, the sergeant who had once measured progress in hedgerows now rode on the back of a half-track along country roads where the only Germans were prisoners or burned-out vehicles. The character of the war in Normandy had changed. The question was whether Montgomery's stalled battle around Caen had delayed this moment unnecessarily, or, as he insisted, had been the essential anvil against which Patton's hammer now fell. In the weeks that followed, that question would take on sharpened edges, as Patton's Third Army drove 250 miles across France while Montgomery sought to frame the campaign story in terms that favored his own role. In the first week of August 1944, the German command tried one last time to turn Normandy from a disaster into a miracle. On August 7th, under Hitler's direct orders, 4 panzer divisions lunged west from the Mortagne area toward Avranches. Operation Lüttich was supposed to be a spear thrust to the sea, cutting Patton's supply corridor and isolating the American spearheads rampaging through Brittany and toward Le Mans. If it worked, the breakout would become a trap. For the German armored commanders on the ground, it was a forlorn hope executed with inadequate strength. Panzerlehr and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich moved out through morning mist into a sky that soon filled with American fighter bombers. Ultra-decrypts and advanced air reconnaissance had given Allied planners warning. 9 tactical air commands P-47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons tore into the advancing columns, turning roads into twisted strings of burning armor. On the heights around Mortagne, elements of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division, including their much-photographed stand on Hill 314, held stubbornly against the panzers that did reach the American lines. Within days, Lüttich had spent its fury. The German thrust never came close to Avranches. Instead of cutting off Patton, it exposed German flanks and rear to the very encirclement their generals had warned Berlin about for weeks. Patton, reading the situation with predatory clarity, drove harder. Third Army pivoted east. While some corps finished off Brittany's ports, others swung toward Le Mans and then north, aiming to hook behind the German forces still fighting the British and Canadians around Caen and Falaise. Bradley and Montgomery agreed on a plan to encircle the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in what would become the Falaise pocket. Canadians and Poles would push south from Caen and Falaise. Americans would drive north from Argentan. British forces would lean in from the west. German generals interrogated after the war, among them Paul Hauser and Sepp Dietrich, described the sense of impending doom that settled over their headquarters in mid-August. The divisions had been whittled down in 6 weeks of fighting, hammered by Montgomery's repeated blows around Caen and now savaged by Patton's mobile columns in their rear. Yet Hitler's refusal to authorize a timely retreat turned a difficult situation into catastrophe. Units that might have escaped east instead received orders to stand fast until the encirclement closed. As Third Army advanced, Patton urged permission to drive all the way to Falaise and slam the door. Bradley, wary of overextension and concerned about friendly fire risks in a tightening pocket, halted the American drive at Argentan on August 13th. The final gap, the infamous Falaise Gap, would be closed, imperfectly, by Canadian and Polish troops fighting south from Falaise and Trun. The slaughter inside the shrinking pocket was appalling. From August 16th to 21st, Allied artillery and aircraft pounded columns of German vehicles jammed in the narrow escape corridor between Chambois and Trun. Thousands of soldiers died, tens of thousands more were captured. Estimates vary, but roughly half of 7th Army's effective strength was destroyed or taken prisoner. The German front in France ceased to exist as a coherent force. To Eisenhower and Bradley, viewing the battlefield from reconnaissance photographs and situation maps, the meaning was clear: Overlord's decisive phase had finally been achieved. The German armies that had resisted so fiercely in Normandy were broken. The path across France lay open. In this climactic phase, Montgomery's and Patton's roles intersected in ways that would fuel post-war controversy. Montgomery, as overall ground commander, issued the broad directives. His British and Canadian forces had pinned German armor around Caen for weeks, absorbing ferocious counterattacks. His defenders would later argue that this grinding battle fixed the panzers and made the American breakout possible. Patton, they would say, simply exploited the strategic conditions Montgomery had created. But the paper trail is less neat. Montgomery's pre-Overlord orders had promised to take Caen quickly and use it as a springboard, not as a static magnet. His July offensives, Charnwood and Goodwood, were briefed in language suggesting hopes for a breakthrough that never came. Only after these operations stalled did he recast them as deliberate holding actions. Meanwhile, German generals interviewed after the war were explicit: they concentrated armor at Caen because the Allies kept attacking there, not because they believed it was a feint. Patton, for his part, saw matters in blunter terms. In letters home and remarks recorded by staff officers, he portrayed Third Army's dash across France as the moment when the Allied war effort finally broke free of what he considered British caution. In just 3 weeks after activation, his formations advanced some 250 miles, liberating Angers, Chartres, Orleans, and eventually reaching the Seine near Melun and Mantes. Supply lines strained, fuel shortages forced temporary pauses. But the scale and speed of the movement stunned both friend and foe. French civilians, who had seen their countryside reduced to rubble in the static battles around Caen, now watched American columns roll through town after town in clouds of dust, white stars painted on tanks that seemed never to stop. To them, the face of liberation increasingly bore Patton's battered helmet, not Montgomery's beret. Yet even as the Seine crossings were secured, another battle, this time over reputations and narratives, was beginning. Montgomery would claim that his careful design had orchestrated both the attrition at Caen and the breakout in the West. Patton's admirers would insist that only Third Army's wild drive had saved D-Day from devolving into a costly stalemate. The truth, as the documents would show, lay somewhere between these competing legends. But in the late summer of 1944, with German armies streaming east in disarray, few of the men who had fought through hedgerows or burned streets cared who would eventually claim the laurels. They knew only that the campaign, which had nearly bogged down by Caen, had been wrenched back onto its original track by a breakout plan born of American frustration and executed with Patton's relentless energy. By the end of August 1944, the maps in SHAEF headquarters bore almost no resemblance to those that had kept Eisenhower awake in June. Then, the Allied foothold in France had been a thin band of beach and hedgerow, vulnerable to weather, U-boats, and a single well-timed German counterstroke. Now, after Falaise and the Seine crossings, blue arrows representing Allied armies stretched from Brittany to the outskirts of Paris and beyond. German corps that had once defied Montgomery at Caen and bled Bradley in the bocage were reduced to scattered regiments retreating toward the Meuse. From a distance, it could look inevitable. Up close, in Eisenhower's diary entries, Bradley's memoirs, Patton's letters, and the shattered fields around Caen, it had been anything but. The disaster in Montgomery's sector was not a single catastrophic defeat but a cumulative one, a promise unkept, a tempo lost. A campaign that teetered for weeks on the edge of turning into a slog the Western Allies could ill afford. Caen, slated in Montgomery's pre-invasion outline as a D-Day or D+1 objective, had taken more than a month to secure in halves, and longer still to offer meaningful maneuver space. The British and Canadians fought with courage and skill, but their repeated assaults, PERCH, EPSOM, CHARNWOOD, GOODWOOD, consumed armor and infantry at a rate that shocked British manpower planners without delivering the decisive opening the plan had envisioned. Meanwhile, American divisions tore themselves to pieces in the hedgerows. Historians would later calculate that between June 6 and the launch of Cobra on July 25, U.S. forces in Normandy suffered over 100,000 casualties. Many of those losses came in the slow, grinding advance south of Omaha and Utah, where every field became an ambush and every farm lane a killing ground. Bradley later wrote that by mid-July his army was in danger of being bled white without having broken free of the bocage. Eisenhower's notes from the same period reveal his growing unease. The Soviets, hammering their way west in Operation Bagration, had shattered German Army Group Center. Politically, he could not defend a western front that remained inches deep while the Red Army raced toward Warsaw. Strategically, he knew prolonged attrition in Normandy would favor Germany's interior lines and its capacity to shift reserves. In that sense, Patton's breakout was not just an operational success, it was a strategic rescue. Cobra, and the lightning exploitation that followed, restored the timetable Overlord was meant to keep. Third Army's advance across Brittany and then east toward the Seine turned the German position in France from dangerous to untenable. Without that sudden shift from hedgerow attrition to mobile warfare, the Normandy campaign might well have locked into a pattern of costly, incremental gains reminiscent of the First World War, a prospect that haunted every Allied leader. After the guns fell mostly silent in France, another battle began in earnest, the fight over how the story would be told. Montgomery, in his official dispatches and later memoirs, emphasized a grand design in which his forces around can fix the bulk of German armor so that the Americans could break out. He presented Goodwood not as a failed bid for exploitation, but as a deliberate killing battle. In post-war interviews he insisted that he had always intended to pin the Panzers in the east, and that Patton's successes were part of a scheme he had orchestrated from the start. Eisenhower and Bradley, writing with access to the same planning papers, remembered it differently. Bradley called Montgomery's conduct of the Caen battle indecisive and accused him of inflating limited objectives after the fact. Eisenhower, characteristically more diplomatic, nonetheless admitted he had been deeply disappointed by Goodwood's results and by the long delay in gaining the ground east of the Orne that pre-invasion conferences had treated as early goals. German testimony further undermined the notion of a master deception. Panzer commanders such as Fritz Bayerlein and Heinrich Eberbach told Allied interrogators that they concentrated armor around Caen because Allied attacks there were clearly intended as genuine breakthroughs, not feints. They stayed, in other words, because Montgomery kept hitting them, not because they believed he was holding back something larger. Patton, never shy about his own role, summed up the campaign in language as harsh as it was biased. In private he argued that Montgomery had made a balls of Caen, and that only American initiative had saved Overlord from months more of fruitless battering. His diaries and letters, later published, fed a transatlantic myth in which Third Army alone redeemed D-Day from British mismanagement. The historical record resists both extremes. Without Montgomery's stubborn, costly stand around Caen, German armor would have had more freedom to pivot west against Bradley and Patton. Without Patton's ferocious exploitation once Cobra opened the door, Montgomery's efforts would have remained a bloody stalemate on a narrow front. Overlord's success rested on the friction, and eventual synergy, between a cautious, attrition-minded British Field Marshal and an American commander who viewed war as a race to be won at full throttle. For the men who fought under them, those debates were abstractions. British infantry who died in the ruins of Caen, Canadian tankers burning in their Shermans on Bourguebus Ridge, American riflemen left in the hedgerows south of St. Lo. They experienced none of the post-war justifications, only the commands to attack again tomorrow. In the end, saving D-Day was not a single act performed by a single general. It was a 2-month struggle in which plans failed, promises broke, and a campaign on the brink of stagnation was wrenched back onto a path of movement by a breakout that came weeks later, and from a different quarter, than the architects of Overlord had intended. Yet the shape of that salvation matters. It reminds us that even in the most carefully planned operations, success can hinge on recognizing when a strategy has run aground and having the nerve to hand the initiative to someone willing to shatter the script. In the summer of 1944, that someone was George S. Patton, racing east under a cloud of dust while, far behind him, the smoke still rose over Caen.